Picture this, a hospital cloaked in sterile white, its halls humming with secrets, until a scream rips through the silence, sharp as a scalpel, raw as a wound. St. Augustine Hospital is no sanctuary. It's a battlefield, a powder keg primed to blow. Enter Dr. Lila Jackson, a rookie with fire in her veins, stepping into a war she didn't start but damn well might finish. Her enemy, Dr. Lisa Hargrove, a blonde tyrant whose venom could melt steel, ruling with shrieks in a crown of hate. And watching from the shadows, James Carter, a patient with a secret that could torch it all to the ground. What happens when a single voice dares to rise against an empire of cruelty? When the scalpel turns on the surgeon? This is Echoes of Valor, a tale of defiance, betrayal, and a reckoning that'll leave you cheering or reeling. Buckle up because the fuse is lit and the blast is coming. If you're ready for this ride, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below. Tell us who you're rooting for or what you'd do in Lila's shoes. Let's ignite this story together, right now. A scream tore through the sterile silence of St. Augustine Hospital, sharp and feral, a sound that didn't belong in a place of healing. It was March 2025, and beneath the cold, unblinking glow of fluorescent lights, something primal stirred. A war poised to erupt, its first shot fired before the day had even begun. Dr. Lila Jackson halted mid-stride, her polished shoes squeaking on the linoleum, her heart slamming against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to break free. She'd barely crossed the threshold of this gleaming medical fortress, her white coat still stiff with newness, when the sound hit her again, a venomous shriek that clawed at the air and pinned her in place. Her leather satchel, stuffed with the blood and sweat of an MD earned through sleepless nights, felt suddenly heavier, a shield she wasn't sure could hold. "You! New girl!" The voice materialized into a figure storming down the hall, a blonde cyclone of rage and disdain. Dr. Lisa Hargrove loomed into view, her crimson lipstick smeared into a snarl, her peroxide hair teased into a crown of chaos that screamed authority. Her eyes, sharp as surgical steel, locked onto Lila with a predator's precision, sizing her up like prey too small to bother, with yet too bold to ignore. She was a legend here, a self-anointed queen who'd ruled St. Augustine for decades, her heels a metronome of terror to every nurse and doctor who dared cross her path. Now she bore down on Lila, her voice rising to a piercing wail that rattled the glass doors and turned heads from the reception desk to the far wards. "What's that in your hands, some pathetic papers to prove you're worth my time?" Lisa spat, her words dripping with acid as she closed the distance, her manicured nails glinting like claws. "Let me make this crystal clear, sweetheart. You're nothing. A speck of dirt I'll grind under my heel before my coffee's cold. You think you can waltz into my hospital with that smug little coat and belong? I'll bury you so deep they'll need a shovel to scrape up the pieces. I'll make sure your name's a stain no one remembers." Her laugh was a jagged shard, slicing through the murmurs of onlookers. Nurses clutching charts, orderlies pausing mid-step, as she towered over Lila, her perfume a choking cloud of lavender and spite. Lila's breath snagged, Lisa's venom a physical force that shoved her back a step, but she didn't crumble. At 32, she'd faced worse. Poverty's gnawing hunger, residency's endless grind, the sneers of classmates who'd whispered she'd never make it. She'd clawed her way to the top of her class, a single mother with a son's future riding on every exam, every stitch, every sleepless night, her deep brown eyes, pools of midnight where resilience burned like a hidden star, met Lisa's glare head-on, unyielding. Her fingers tightened around her satchel, the leather creaking under her grip, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, a quiet blade cutting through the storm. "Good morning, Dr. Hargrove. I'm Dr. Lila Jackson, starting today. I'm here to serve this hospital's patients. Nothing more, nothing less." Lisa's face twisted, her laugh erupting again, a vicious, glass-shattering cackle that bounced off the white walls. "Serve? Oh, honey, you'll be lucky to crawl out of here alive. I don't coddle charity cases. I crush them underfoot like the roaches they are. Get in my way and you'll wish you'd stayed in whatever filthy hole you crawled out of. She spun on her heel, her sensible pumps stabbing the floor like gunfire, her blonde hair whipping behind her as she stormed off, leaving a wake of stunned silence and the faint tremble of a clipboard dropped by a nearby nurse. The hallway buzzed, whispers swelling like a hive roused to anger. But Lila stood firm, her pulse racing, her mother's voice a lifeline threading through the chaos. They'll try to bury you, baby girl, her mother had rasped years ago, her hands rough from scrubbing hospital floors to pay for Lila's books, her eyes fierce with a love that defied despair. But you're a seed. Grow through the cracks and show 'em what you're made of. You've got steel in your spine, more than they'll ever know. Lila exhaled, the memory a balm against Lisa's sting, her breath a silent vow etched in iron. She'd come too far to break. Not for herself, not for her boy waiting at home with his gap-toothed grin, not for the dream she'd bled rivers to claim. But she wasn't alone in that moment. Down the hall, beyond the cluster of gawking staff, a pair of eyes tracked her from a hospital bed, unblinking and razor-sharp. James Carter lay propped against starched pillows, his arms bound in casts from a skiing accident that had landed him here weeks ago. To the nurses bustling past, he was just another patient, graying hair mussed, gown rumpled. A nobody lost in the churn of St. Augustine's machine, but his gray eyes burned with a fire that cut through the haze, piercing Lila's every move, drinking in Lisa's every shriek. His silence was a coiled viper, his gaze a riddle wrapped in steel, heavy with a power that didn't belong in a sickbed. He shifted slightly, his head tilting as if weighing her, his lips parting just enough to murmur something lost to the din. Who was this man, lying in wait like a shadow with claws? What did he see in Lila? A spark, a weapon, a pawn in a game she couldn't yet name. Why did his stare feel like the tick of a bomb, buried deep in the hospital's bones, its fuse already lit? The questions hung there, unanswered, as a nurse coughed nervously nearby, her clipboard trembling in her hands. Lila squared her shoulders, Lisa's threat still a bitter echo in her ears. But her mother's words roared louder, a call to arms she couldn't ignore. She took her first step forward, the satchel swinging at her side, her shoes clicking with a defiance that matched Lisa's retreating gunfire. The hospital wasn't just a workplace, it was a battlefield, and something colossal was stirring beneath its sterile surface. Lisa's scream had lit the fuse, a war cry that promised blood. Whose empire would it topple when the blast came? Whose crown would rise from the wreckage? The halls of St. Augustine Hospital pulsed with a restless heartbeat, a beast roused from its sterile slumber as Dr. Lila Jackson plunged into her first shift. Her stethoscope hung heavy around her neck, a cold steel pendulum ticking against her chest. Her mind a fortress of knowledge forged in the crucible of residency. Years of stitching flesh under flickering lights, decoding vitals in the dead of night, her hands steady through exhaustion that would have broken lesser souls. She was a doctor, damn it, not a punching bag, her MD a badge carved from sleepless nights and a mother's sacrifice. But Lisa Hargrove had other plans, and the battlefield she'd unleashed was a gauntlet of fire, every step a dare to snap Lila's spine or set her spirit ablaze. It started with a crash that jolted the ward like a thunderclap. A young nurse, her badge reading Tara, her eyes wide with terror, stumbled toward Lila, her arms trembling as she thrust a teetering stack of charts into Lila's hands. "Doctor! Hargrove's orders!" Tara gasped, her voice a ragged whisper, her sneakers squeaking as she bolted back down the hall, fleeing some unseen wrath. Lila caught the pile before it spilled, her fingers brushing the edges. Cardiac failure with a maze of arrhythmias, trauma bleed fresh from a crumpled car, diabetic collapse teetering on a razor's edge of coma. These weren't cases. They were a rogue's gallery of nightmares, the kind that made seasoned surgeons pause, their complexity a silent scream of sabotage. Lila's jaw tightened, her pulse quickening as Lisa's earlier shriek clawed through her memory. "I'll bury you so deep they'll need a shovel." This wasn't a test, it was an execution. a guillotine dressed up as duty, and Lisa was yanking the rope with glee. Lila sucked in a breath, the antiseptic sting sharp in her nose, and flipped open the first chart, her eyes scanning the scrawl with a precision honed by years of midnight cramming. She wasn't new to pressure. Residency had been a meat grinder. Her son's tiny hand her only tether through nights of doubt. But this was personal, a war declared in that first scream. She dove in, her hands a blur as she spiked IVs, her voice a lifeline threading through the chaos. "Mr. Evans, stay with me." Deep breaths, she murmured to the cardiac patient, his gray face slick with sweat, his eyes flickering with fear as she adjusted his drip with surgical calm. She ordered labs, stat, her tone crisp, cutting through the ward's hum, her residency instincts roaring to life. She'd just stabilized him, her fingers lingering on his pulse as it steadied, when the air shifted, a storm rolling in on clicking heels. "Jackson!" Lisa's voice cracked like a whip, shredding the ward's fragile peace. She loomed at the bedside, her blonde hair a halo of menace, her crimson lips bared in a snarl that promised blood. "What's this snail's pace? I've got a board breathing down my neck, and you're dragging us into the gutter with your fumbling. Fix it, or I'll fix you, you useless speck." Her shriek ricocheted off the monitors, her hands planted on her hips, her perfume a choking fog that turned heads. Nurses froze mid-step. A janitor dropped his mop with a clatter. Lila's heart slammed, but she straightened, her gaze locking onto Lisa's with a cold fire. "Patient stable, Dr. Hargrove," she said, her voice a blade of ice slicing through the heat. "EKG's ordered. Results in 10. He's holding." "Don't you dare lecture me," Lisa roared, her face flushing red, her eyes blazing like twin furnaces. "I was slicing hearts open while you were sucking your thumb in some backwater dump. One more slip, and I'll have you scraping bedpans. Or better yet, out on the street where trash like you belongs." She spun away, her heels stabbing the floor like nails in a coffin, her venom leaving a trail of stunned silence, and the faint tremble of a clipboard in Tara's shaking hands. Lila's nails bit into her palms, her breath hitching as Lisa's words seared her skin. "Useless speck. Trash." Each one a dagger aimed at her core. Her mother's rasp rose through the haze, rough and unyielding. "Catch their stones, baby girl. Build a wall." She exhaled, shoving the pain deep, and marched to the next patient, her shoes clicking, with a defiance that echoed Lisa's retreat. The ward buzzed, whispers swelling like hornets. But Lisa's voice trailed her, a venomous echo from the break room, loud enough to pierce the walls. "She's a quota hire. Watch her crack like cheap glass." The day was a siege, relentless and brutal. Lisa piled on the cases, each one a thornier trap, while she lounged with a coffee mug, her voice a megaphone of disdain, to a cluster of cowed colleagues. "I don't know why they let filth like her in here," she drawled, her words slithering through the halls as Lila wrestled a trauma bleed, her gloves slick with crimson, her mind racing to clamp the artery. She didn't flinch, not when the diabetic's sugar crashed, not when she barked orders to a scrambling team, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. Then came Harold Grayson, a grizzled bull of a man, his hip shattered from a fall, his hate sharper than the fracture. "I ain't letting you near me," he bellowed as Lila approached, his spit flecking the air, his meaty hands swatting at her. "Get me a real doctor, not some charity case off the street." The room stilled. Nurses gaped, a monitor beeped in protest. But Lisa's shadow slunk in, her grin a blade unsheathed. "Told you, Jackson," she purred, her voice dripping with glee, her arms crossed like a judge passing sentence. "No one wants you here. Maybe the janitor's closet's more your speed. Suits your kind, doesn't it?" Lila's chest burned, her throat tightening as Grayson's roar and Lisa's taunt collided, a double blow that rattled her bones. But she stepped closer, her eyes locking onto Grayson's with a lethal calm. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice low and unyielding. "I'm Dr. Jackson. I'm fixing your hip. Scream all you want, but you'll walk because of me." Her hands moved, a blur of steel adjusting his drip, silencing his curses with a skill Lisa couldn't touch. The old man's protests faded to a grunt, But Lisa's laughter lingered, a vulture's cackle that chased Lila down the hall. Exhaustion clawed at her as she turned away, her legs trembling, her coat heavy with sweat. But a voice cut through, deep, steady, a lifeline in the inferno. "Dr. Jackson." James Carter leaned forward from his bed, his gray eyes blazing through the haze, his cast no mask for the power coiled beneath. "You're a damn force," he said, his words a quiet thunderclap that stilled the air. "They're blind if they don't see it. Ever thought of burning this place down and building it right?" Lila blinked, his voice a spark igniting her gut, her fatigue peeling back to reveal a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or rage. "I'm just surviving, Mr. Carter," she murmured, her voice rough, but his smirk said he saw deeper, a fuse she didn't know she held. Before she could press, a code blue blared, yanking her back into the fray. Another patient, another fight. Lisa's shadow loomed, her venom a ticking clock counting down to detonation. James's gaze tracked her, a hunter's stare piercing the chaos, his silence a loaded gun. The gauntlet was ablaze and the flames were rising. Who'd be consumed when they roared to life? The clock in St. Augustine Hospital struck noon with a hollow clang, its chimes swallowed by a rising tide of chaos that pulsed through the sterile corridors. Dr. Lila Jackson sprinted down the hall, her white coat flapping like a tattered flag of war, her lungs burning from a shift that had morphed into a relentless gauntlet. She'd dodged Lisa Hargrove's mines all morning, patience teetering on death's edge, insults sharp as shrapnel, the weight of hate pressing down like a vice. But the air crackled now with something bigger, something final. A code blared through the intercom, raw and jagged. "OR3, stat, ruptured aorta." Lila's heart slammed into her ribs, a drumbeat of dread and adrenaline. This wasn't just a surgery, it was Lisa's killing blow, and the hospital was a coliseum primed for blood. She skidded to a stop at the OR doors, her sneakers squealing on the linoleum, her breath ragged as she clutched her stethoscope like a lifeline. The double doors loomed, their steel sheen reflecting a flicker of her own face. Sweat-streaked, eyes wide but unyielding. Before she could catch her bearings, Lisa burst through, a blonde banshee in scrubs, her crimson lips twisted into a snarl that promised carnage. "Jackson!" she shrieked, her voice a sonic boom that rattled the glass observation deck above, where board members in crisp suits and reporters with hungry cameras leaned forward like vultures. "You're with me. High-profile case. Critical stakes. Screw this up, and I'll carve your career into ribbons right here, you pathetic little roach. Move, now!" Lila's stomach lurched, a cold sweat prickling her spine, but she nodded, her voice cutting through the storm with icy calm. "I'm ready, Dr. Hargrove." Lisa's eyes glinted, her laugh a venomous hiss that slithered through the air. "Ready? You'll be begging for mercy when I'm through with you, you sniveling speck." She shoved past, her shoulder slamming into Lila's, her heels clicking like a countdown to doom as she stormed into the prep area. Lila followed, her hands trembling as she scrubbed in. The scalding water a jolt against her skin, her mind racing through the procedure, thoracotomy, vessel repair, a tightrope over a chasm of death. The OR was a crucible of light and steel, its air thick with antiseptic intention. The patient, a middle-aged man, his face ashen from a car wreck, lay splayed on the table, his chest rising in shallow, desperate gasps, his blood pressure a plummeting line on the monitor. Lila pulled on her gloves, the snap echoing like a gunshot, her eyes darting to the observation deck where the audience watched, their silhouettes a jury poised to judge her fall. Lisa stood at the table, her presence a dark cloud, her hands already gloved, her scalpel glinting under the lights. "Let's see if you're worth the dirt on my shoes," she growled, her voice low but lethal, her smirk a blade unsheathed. The surgery erupted like a tempest. Lila fell into rhythm beside Lisa, passing tools with a surgeon's grace. Retractors, clamps, her hands steady despite the storm in her chest. She monitored vitals, her voice barking updates to the anesthesiologist. "Pressure's dropping. Push fluids." Her residency instincts roaring through every move. The room hummed, nurses darted, Monitors beeped, but Lisa faltered. Her hands, once legendary for their precision, shook as she hovered over the aorta, a bead of sweat rolling down her temple, her breath hitching. "Scalpel!" she snapped, her voice cracking like glass. And Lila obeyed, sliding it into her grip, her gut twisting into knots. The angle was wrong, dead wrong. Lila saw it in an instant, her mind flashing to textbooks, cadavers, the countless nights she'd memorized every vessel's path. If Lisa cut there, she'd shred the posterior branch, flooding the cavity with blood, killing the man in seconds. "Doctor? Hargrove!" Lila's voice sliced through the din, sharp and unyielding, her body leaning forward as if to shield the patient herself. "You're off. You'll hit the branch vessel. Shift now, or he's gone." The OR froze. Nurses gasped. The scrub tech's tray clattered. The deck above went silent as every eye swiveled to Lisa. Her face flushed crimson, her scalpel trembling in her grip, her eyes blazing with a fury that could melt steel. "You dare!" she screamed, her voice a jagged howl that shook the walls, her body lunging toward Lila like a beast unleashed. "I've gutted more chests than you've seen in your miserable, worthless life, you insolent worm. Shut your mouth or I'll cut you next, right here, right now." Lila didn't flinch, her feet planted, her gaze locked on Lisa's. "It's his life, not your pride," she said, her voice a whip of steel, her hands clenched at her sides. "Shift the damn angle, or watch him die and explain it to them." She jerked her head toward the deck, where the board leaned closer, their murmurs a rising tide. For a heartbeat, Lisa's rage teetered on madness, her scalpel glinting as if she'd strike Lila down. Then the weight of the watching eyes, the board, the press, the hospital's future, crushed her. She snarled, a guttural sound of defeat, and shifted, her cut following Lila's call. The repair held, the bleeding stopped, the man's vitals stabilized, a victory snatched from the jaws of disaster. Lila had saved him, and the room knew it, the nurses exhaling in unison, the deck buzzing with awe. But Lisa's wrath was a live wire, sparking for blood. She ripped off her gloves as the team closed up, her voice a low, feral growl that sent a chill down Lila's spine. "Jackson, room now!" Lila followed, dread coiling tight, into James Carter's chamber. The door slammed like a thunderclap, and Lisa unleashed hell. "You filthy, gutless rat!" she roared, lunging forward, her finger jabbing an inch from Lila's face, her blonde hair wild with fury. "You think you can shame me in there? You're a stain, a low-life fraud who'll never be a doctor. I'll rip your name to shreds, torch your life, make sure every soul in this city knows you're a sniveling pile of filth I'll stomp into oblivion. You're done, done, done." Her words were a torrent of acid, each one a lash tearing at Lila's soul, her son's gap-toothed smile, her mother's rough hands, years of fight flashing in her mind's eye. Tears stung, hot and furious, but she bit them back, her voice a whisper of steel through the storm. "I saved him, Dr. Hargrove. That's what matters." Lisa's laugh was a banshee's wail, her face contorted with hate. "Saved him? I'll bury you alive, you—" "Enough!" The command cracked like lightning, halting Lisa mid-scream, the air turning to ice. James Carter rose from his bed, his casted arms a warrior's badge, his gray eyes blazing with a fury that swallowed the room whole. "Dr. Hargrove," he said, his voice a lethal rumble that vibrated through the floor. "You just spat on the doctor who saved your ass, and that man's life. You're finished." Lisa's jaw dropped, her bravado imploding into a whimper. "Who the hell are you?" she gasped, her hands clawing at nothing. James stepped closer, his smile a blade unsheathed, cold and deadly. "James Carter, CEO of Healthcare United. I've been your shadow for weeks. Every word, every threat caught on this." He raised a recorder, its red light a death knell pulsing in the silence, and pressed play. Lisa's voice shrieked back. "Filthy rat! Sniveling filth!" A mirror of her own damnation that echoed off the walls. Her knees buckled, her scream choking into a sob as the fuse she'd lit blew her world to ash. Lila stood, heart pounding, tears drying as James's gaze met hers, a spark igniting the wreckage. The Colosseum had roared, the blast had landed, but whose crown would rise from the rubble? The air in James Carter's hospital room crackled with the aftershock of Lisa Hargrove's recorded venom, a storm unleashed from the small black device in his hand. Its red light pulsed like a dying ember. The playback on filthy rat, sniveling filth, stomp you into oblivion, a noose tightening around her neck with every vicious syllable. Dr. Lila Jackson stood rooted to the spot, her white coat a tattered banner, soaked with the sweat of a shift-turned battlefield, her dark eyes wide as Lisa's screams looped in the sterile air, each word a ghost of the war she'd barely survived. Lisa herself staggered, her blonde hair a wild tangle of ruin, her crimson lips parted in a silent, gaping howl as the empire she'd clawed into being crumbled beneath her feet. James advanced, his casted arms no shield but a testament to the power coiled in his frame, his gray eyes blazing like twin infernos that scorched the room. "Doctor Hargrove," he thundered, his voice a deep quake that rattled the walls. "You've ruled this hospital like a tyrant, crushing souls, risking lives, spitting hate at a doctor who's worth 10 of you. Did you think the shadows wouldn't bite back?" He waved the recorder, its sleek surface glinting under the fluorescent lights. "A weapon forged in weeks of silent vigilance. Every shriek you've unleashed, every slur you've spat since I landed in this bed, it's all here, a ledger of your poison. Your throne's ash now. Deal with it." Lisa's legs buckled, her knees hitting the floor with a dull thud, her hands clawing at the air as if she could rip the truth apart. "This is insane," she screeched, her voice a jagged shard of panic that pierced the stillness, her eyes darting wildly from James to Lila. "I'm the backbone of this place. She's nothing. A rookie who dared defy me. It's a setup. Play that trash again, and I'll sue you blind." Her fingers scrabbled at the linoleum, her nails gouging faint scratches as she hauled herself up, her face a furnace of desperation and rage. "Trash?" James's voice dropped, a blade of ice slicing through her hysteria, his steps closing the gap until he towered over her. "She saved a man's life while you flailed like a butcher in there. Nearly killed him with your ego. This," he hit play again, Lisa's venom roaring back. "I'll rip your name to shreds, torch your life. This is your masterpiece. Choke on it." The words looped, a relentless mirror she couldn't shatter, her own voice a banshee's wail damning her with every echo. Lila flinched, the sound clawing at her. "Filth, oblivion." Each barb a lash against her son's smile, her mother's rough hands, the years she'd fought to stand here. Lisa's face crumpled, rage melting into terror as the playback droned on, her hands rising to cover her ears, her blonde hair falling in sweaty strands across her eyes. I was upholding standards," she gasped, her voice cracking, her body swaying as she clutched the edge of a chair, her nails digging into the fabric until it tore. "She's the fraud, her and her meddling. I built this hospital. I deserve respect." Her plea was a ragged sob, her crimson lipstick smearing as she swiped at her face, her empire slipping through her fingers like sand. James's gaze hardened, his voice a whisper of steel that cut deeper than any shout. "Respect is earned, not screamed for, and you've earned a grave, nothing more." He turned to Lila, his expression softening but fierce, a flicker of something, pride maybe, breaking through his icy calm. "Dr. Jackson, you faced a monster today and walked away taller. I'm sorry you had to bleed for it." Lila's throat tightened, her hands trembling as she met his eyes. Lisa's venom still a raw wound in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she managed, her voice hoarse but steady, her tears swallowed back with a grit she'd honed through years of battle. "I just wanted to do my job, save who I could." Her fingers brushed her stethoscope, its weight a reminder of why she'd fought. Her son's gap-toothed grin a light in the dark. Before James could reply, the door crashed open, a gust of authority sweeping in with Dr. Evelyn Pierce, the hospital's steely administrator, her gray suit pristine against the chaos. 2 security guards flanked her, their black uniforms stark, their faces set like stone. Evelyn's eyes widened at the scene. Lisa crumpled on the floor, James towering with his recorder, Lila poised between them, then narrowed into slits of cold judgment. "Mr. Carter," she snapped, her voice a whip of command. "Your page said emergency. What the hell is this?" James thrust the recorder forward, his tone a guillotine's fall that brooked no argument. "Hargrove's done. She's a cancer eating this place alive. Cut her out, Pierce, or I will." Evelyn took the device, her fingers steady as she pressed play, and Lisa's voice flooded the room again, a tidal wave of hate that drowned her whimpered protests. "Sniveling pile of filth! Stomp you into oblivion!" Each word a hammer blow to her fate. Evelyn's jaw tightened, her lips thinning into a line of fury as the tape ended, her eyes flicking to Lisa with a disgust that could have curdled blood. "Unforgivable," she hissed, her voice low and lethal. "Dr. Hargrove, you're suspended, effective immediately. Guards, remove her, now." "No!" Lisa's scream was a banshee's wail, her body thrashing as the guards seized her arms, their grips iron against her flailing. "You can't do this. I'm St. Augustine. I'll sue, ruin you all." Her heels skidded on the floor, her blonde hair whipping like a flag in a hurricane as they dragged her toward the door, her voice rising to a pitch that shattered the air. "Jackson, you're dead. You hear me? Dead. I'll claw my way back and bury you." Her words faded into a distant shriek, swallowed by the hall's white void, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. Evelyn spun to James, her composure fraying, her hands clenched at her sides. "How deep does this rot go, Carter?" "Why didn't I know?" "Deep enough to sink you," he shot back, his tone unyielding, his casted arm gesturing to the chaos left behind. "I'm James Carter, CEO of Healthcare United. Not just a patient you're damn reckoning. This hospital's a cesspit of fear and filth. Fix it or I'll tear it down myself." He turned to Lila, his gaze a steel lifeline piercing the haze. "And she's your salvation. Dr. Jackson's got more guts and brains than Hargrove ever dreamed. She's joining my task force, starting now, to burn out this rot and build something worth a damn." Lila's breath hitched, Lisa's venom still clawing at her soul. "Dead. Bury you." But James's words lit a spark, a flame flickering in the ashes of her exhaustion. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her hands trembling as she wiped sweat from her brow, her mind reeling from the shift beneath her feet. "I'm just a doctor. I didn't ask for this." "Say yes," James pressed, his voice a quiet command that steadied her. "You've faced hell and won. Skill, spine, heart. Help me remake this place. For every patient she endangered, every soul she crushed." Her son's face flashed, his crayons, his trust, and her mother's rasp roared through her. "Grow through the cracks." "Yes," Lila said, her voice rising like a blade unsheathed, her shoulders squaring as the weight lifted. "I'm in. For them." Evelyn nodded curtly, her eyes flicking between them. "I'll call the board. Emergency session tonight." She strode out, her heels a sharp tattoo against the floor, leaving Lila and James in the wreckage of Lisa's reign. Lila sank against the wall, her legs trembling as adrenaline bled into exhaustion, her mother's words a lifeline threading through the chaos. "You're a seed, baby girl." She'd taken root, the cracks were widening, and the empire was dust. Outside, whispers surged through the halls. Lisa's fall, a fissure in the stone. James watched her, his recorder still, his eyes a promise of storms yet to come. The ashes were settling, the gauntlet cold. But what would rise from the ruin? 6 months had swept past since the storm shattered St. Augustine Hospital, its once impenetrable walls now cracked open and reborn under the weight of truth. The sterile halls, once a tomb of whispered fear, and Lisa Hargrove's venom, thrummed with a new heartbeat, a pulse of renewal that vibrated through the linoleum, the air alive with voices unshackled. Nurses laughed over charts, their chatter a melody where silence once reigned. Doctors swapped ideas across break-room tables, their shoulders unbowed by dread. Dr. Lila Jackson strode through it, her white coat no longer a shield, but a mantle of hard-won power, her dark eyes blazing with a fire that had scorched the old order to ash. The scars of her first day, Lisa's shrieks, the weight of hate, had hardened into steel, a foundation for the future she'd clawed into being. Lisa's fall had been a thunderclap that rocked the city, a collapse so swift and brutal it left echoes in every corner. James Carter's recordings, hours of her venomous reign captured in cold, unyielding audio, had ignited a firestorm that no one could douse. The hospital board, cornered by a tidal wave of public outrage in Healthcare United's iron ultimatum, moved like lightning. Within days, Lisa was gone. Her suspension a formality before the axe fell, her permanent dismissal sealed by a flood of witnesses who'd finally found their voices. Nurses she'd broken with her screeches, doctors she'd silenced with her sneers, patients she'd dismissed with a flick of her crimson lips. They all stepped forward, their stories a chorus of condemnation that buried her deeper with every word. Her license was revoked in a closed-door ethics hearing, her name splashed across headlines. Tyrant doctor banished in shame, until it became a curse spat in dark corners, a warning whispered to new hires. She'd fled, rumors said, her empire a smoldering wreck, her venom spent against the truth she'd mocked. Lila didn't linger on the ashes. She'd seized James's task force like a lifeline, a ragtag band of reformers fueled by her grit and his steel resolve. She'd hit the ground running, her residency-honed mind slashing through bureaucracy with a surgeon's precision. Mandatory bias training rolled out in weeks, its sessions packed with staff who'd once cowered. Now they sat straighter, their eyes sharp with purpose. Harassment channels sprang up, posters plastered across break rooms with bold red letters. Speak. We listen. Hiring flipped. Lila scoured resumes herself, unearthing talent buried by Lisa's disdain. Her pen a sword cutting through the old guard's nepotism. She worked late into the night, her desk a battlefield of spreadsheets and coffee mugs, her son asleep in the next room, his crayons scattered across a drawing of her in a white cape, a crown of stars above her head. Every win, a nurse's bold report, a patient's tearful thank you, was a brick in the wall her mother had urged her to build, a testament to the seed that had cracked the stone. St. Augustine rose anew, a phoenix from the rubble. The staff knit together, a tapestry of trust where fear once frayed the seams. Nurses like Tara, once trembling, now bantered with doctors over lunch. Orderlies swapped stories with surgeons, their voices no longer hushed. A young doctor, Dr. Malik, fresh from residency like Lila, took Lisa's old post, his dark eyes sharp, his handshake a promise of alliance as he told Lila, "I'm here because of you. Let's keep it moving." Patient trust surged, their satisfaction scores climbing as the hospital's name clawed back from disgrace, its lobby bustling with faces that mirrored the city. Brown, white, young, old, all drawn by a reputation reborn. Lila stood at its heart, her quiet steel a beacon that lit the way, her presence a whisper of change that roared louder every day. James Carter summoned her on a crisp September morning, his office a tower of glass overlooking the city's sprawl, his Cass long gone, his salt and pepper hair sleek against his skull. He leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes glinting with a pride that softened his stern edges, and slid a badge across his desk. Director of Cultural Innovation, Healthcare United. "You've rewritten this hospital, Jackson," he said, his voice a steady rumble that filled the room. "Not just here, across our network. You're the fire we need, the spark that's burning out the rot. Take it. This isn't a request." Lila's fingers brushed the badge, its cool metal a jolt against her skin, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm still green," she said, her voice raw and real, her eyes searching his. "I've barely started. Can I carry this?" "You already have," James shot back, leaning forward, his hands steepled like a general plotting victory. "You faced a monster and turned her to dust. Skill, guts, vision. I saw it that first day in that scream-filled hall. I'll guide you, not rule you. Say yes, Lila. The system's begging for you." Her son's grin flashed, his faith her anchor, his latest drawing pinned in her mind, a warrior in white. Her mother's rasp roared through her, rough and fierce. "Grow through the cracks, baby girl." "Yes," Lila said, her voice rising like a clarion call, her shoulders squaring as she gripped the badge. For them, for everyone she crushed. The proof came that fall at a national healthcare conference. A cavernous hall packed with a sea of faces, doctors, administrators, reporters, hanging on her every word. She stepped to the mic, her blouse simple, her hair pulled back, her presence seismic as she faced the crowd. "A year ago," she declared, her voice cutting through the hush like a blade. "I walked into St. Augustine, a rookie, branded filth by a tyrant who swore I'd break. She screamed I'd burn, called me a gutter rat, a stain, a nobody who'd never belong. I didn't burn, I blazed." She laid it bare. The surgery's razor edge, Lisa's venomous torrent, the rebirth of a hospital from its ashes, her scars a badge of honor, her triumphs a war cry that shook the rafters. "This isn't just my fight," she roared, her eyes sweeping the room, locking on faces that mirrored her own. Hungry, defiant. "It's for every doctor she silenced, every nurse she broke, every patient she scorned. I'm their voice, and I'll never shut up." The room erupted, a tidal wave of applause crashing like thunder, hands pounding tables, feet stomping the floor. James clapped from the wings, his nod a seal of victory, his gray eyes glinting with a rare warmth. Then Lila saw her, Lisa Hargrove, a specter slinking in the back, her blonde hair limp and dull, her face gaunt with defeat, her crimson lipstick faded to a smear. Their eyes locked, Lisa's hollow with a bitter impotence, Lila's ablaze with a defiance that burned through the distance. Lisa flinched, turned, and fled, a shadow swallowed by the crowd, her reign erased in the roar of Lila's triumph. Back at St. Augustine, a bronze plaque gleamed in the lobby. "Dr. Lila Jackson, courage breaks the stone." Its edges worn by hands that brushed it daily. Staff and patients alike pausing to nod at the woman who changed everything. That night, Lila stood at her apartment window, the city a sea of lights below, her son's drawing clutched in her hand. A warrior, a crown, a starlit sky. The battles loomed, systems to topple, wars to wage. But she was rooted, a force unyielding, her mother's voice a steady pulse. "You're a seed, baby girl." The dawn had broken, its fire hers to wield. The stone was dust, the cracks wide. And what empires would she build next?